Hey everyone, I wanted to make a soft welcome to spring feeling dress for my youngest daughter, and here is the darling dress that I came up with. I used this lavender featherwear corduroy, which I think is a perfect transition from winter to spring fabric. And I did pre-wash the fabric, and that's a question I get asked a lot, and I am not ready to go down that rabbit hole yet, so just bear with me. I pre-washed her, which is the safer than sorry route, and then I ironed that fabric back together. And I find the easiest and best way to do this is to rip one end across the grain and use that to line things up so you're ensuring that everything is square. So I'm making sure that the rip edge is square, and then I am putting the selvage edges together, and I'm ironing from the selvage edges to the center fold of the fabric. Alright, so on to lining up your pattern pieces, and I don't normally include this into my tutorials, but I am doing things a little bit differently, including a little bit of a trick. Also, friendly reminder, do be mindful of any fabric net that you may have. I'm using corduroy, so I'm placing all of my pattern pieces so they pet nicely from top to bottom. Okay, so for the first round of pieces, I'm putting the skirt on the fold of the fabric and then the bodice back as well as the bodice back lining and cutting out those pieces. Then I open my fabric up so I can fold it on the selvage edges, meeting instead of just laying on top of each other. So I fold over one side until it's just wide enough to cut out that second copy of the skirt, and then the other portion of fabric will also get folded over, and this fold will be used to cut out the front bodice as well as the front bodice lining, both cut out on the fold. Finally, the sleeve piece can go on the bodice side if you're making a smaller size, or it can go on the skirt size. There is plenty of room here. I'm using a contrasting fabric to do the bias strips and the little back ties. I'm also sprinkling some embroidery work, and there are two methods of madness here, so you can go the first route, cutting out a larger rectangle on that bodice front, and then tracing around the edges with a removable marker. I'm also roughly outlining my seam allowance so I can position the embroidery motif properly. I'm just rotating around until I like the look. It is not rocket science, so please do not overthink this. Next, I transfer that into my embroidery hoop, and yes, the hoop should be wrapped in fabric, and that is a whole nother story for another time. But I'm using these delicious shades of purple, green, and pink floche for a soft, pretty look. I start with the pink using just one strand, tying a knot at the end and bringing that needle up on my fabric. Then I wrap my needle around the floche twice, and I put that needle back into my fabric, and I pull tight so the knot cinches up on my needle to create a French knot. I continue to do this for all the flower centers. Just a word of caution, do not press your finger against the fabric. This will distort the little area of fabric around the top of your finger, leaving you with this lovely little bubble in your fabric, and there is really no solving that issue. So I tie off when I'm done with those French knots and trim up that thread. Next, I moved on to the lazy daisies, and these are super beginner friendly. I use one strand and tying a knot at the end and coming up to the right side of my fabric. I go over a little ways from my entry point and then up at the end of my lazy daisy, and from there I make sure my thread is under my needle, and I go down on the other side of that end of the entry point, and voila, a lazy daisy. And I continue this around all of the flowers until all of the petals are complete. Finally, I take that green shade and I use it to make the leaves. Once again, I'm just using one strand and tying a knot at the end. To do the stem area, I'm using the stem stitch. I know it, folks, I am here all day. To do this, I keep my working thread below my needle, coming up a little ways onto the previous stitch, and I continue that until the whole stem is complete. And I finish with all those leaves with the lazy daisy stitch as well. But like I said, there are two methods of madness here, so let's go over that second method. You could cut out the entire pattern piece instead. Side note, make sure to place a notch or a mark at the X of the top of the bodice as well as the bottom of the bodice. These X placements are showing where the bodice will be gathered later on. So the second method is an option since this is such a small amount of embroidery work and the stitches work fairly well without a hoop. And you can sew that shoulder seam together before doing the embroidery work. This will make lining up the embroidery motif easier since you will only have to consider the seam allowance around the neckline. Once again, I transfer my embroidery motif using a friction heat activated pin, and keep in mind that the last inch or so will be folded over onto the lining side. So it's not like you're going to have a huge empty space of fabric here. And I carefully wrap my fabric around my finger, but I keep the point of my finger out of this equation. Again, you don't want to have those little lovely distorted bubbles creeping up on you. So when you do this method, be mindful that you aren't pulling too much on your thread. You want things to lay nicely on the back side of your work, flat and all of that jazz. So after all of the shoulder seams are joined for the bodice, then I put 2 rows of gather threads, one on each side of where those permanent stitches are going to go later on. I do this for the top of the bodice as well as that bottom section of the bodice. And from there, it's a matter of pulling up on those gather threads and evenly distributing the gathers until the bodice matches up with the lining of the bodice. And you can simply lay the lining front right on top of the bodice front to verify the length of everything. And then I secure those gather sections down with a regular stitch length, back stitching on both ends. So now we can catch up our bodice lining pieces by joining those together at the side seams. So I put the bodice back pieces together with the bodice front pieces with right sides together and join each shoulder seam on my machine. I iron up all those seams and move on to the bias bands. Like I mentioned before, I'm using a contrasting fabric for those bias bands, and I think this fabric is just so delightful. It is so soft and pretty. So I cut 1-inch wide bias strips and then fold that in half, with right sides of my fabric on the outside so the wrong sides of my fabric are touching. Hope that makes sense. Then I switch my foot to a zipper foot, but if you are fancy enough to have a piping foot, by all means enjoy. I place this little mini cording inside my bias band and stitch around, creating piping. I find it helpful to nudge the cording into place at that fold with my fingernails. Of course, you could simply buy ready-made piping instead. Farmhouse Fabrics has a huge selection of both mini and regular size to choose from. Regardless of how your piping comes to life, it's a nice trick to pull the end of the cording and trim off the first 1/2 inch or so. I learned this trick from the fabulous Cindy Foose, and this eliminates the bulk as it goes into the seam. So I angle that raw edge of the piping so it'll get covered by the seam later on. And then I stitch the piping into place around that neckline. And when I get to the other end, I use my seam ripper to kind of fish out that cording so I can give it a little tug and trim off that last 1/2 inch or so, again to reduce the bulk. And now I'm ready to join the bodice to its lining. I first do this by sewing down the backs of the bodice, both center backs. Then I line up the bodice to its lining at those shoulder seams. And you can see how that back facing will wrap around so the seam is on the lining side of the bodice. It's kind of neat, right? So I join the necklines together with the previous stitches of the piping facing up so I can sew right on top of them, ensuring a clean transition here. And then I trim up the ends of the neckline and put a bunch of clips around that curve so everything can, expand and relax and lay nice and flat without any puckers. Finally, last but certainly not least, I think it's a great step to understitch. I flip the entire seam to the lining side, and then I stitch very closely to the neckline seam. I give everything a really good ironing and move on to those straps. And these are 1-inch wide straps cut on the straight grain. The length is given by the pattern or however long you'd like them to be. So you can fold up each side of your strip about 1/4 inch and iron that into place. And then fold the entire thing together so your folded edges are kind of, even-ish. Make sure to fold under one side of the strap so there's a finished edge at the end of that strap. And of course, alternatively, you could run your straps through a bias maker if you are fancy enough to have one. So you need 6 straps total if you're following the pattern. and then stitch right along that folded edge to join the strap together. Alternatively, yes, you could sew the strap with right sides together and then flip it right sides out. There are pros and cons to each method, so pick whatever makes you happy. Next, we're going to attach the straps to the bodice side on the front of the bodice. Make sure the lining is out of the way of this step. So if you're making the larger sizes 18 months to size 8, line up 3 straps in a row. Whereas if you're making the 2 smaller sizes, size 6 months or 12 months, then stack one of these straps on top of the other straps. And then I secured all of those straps into place, and you're just kind of basting over top of them. Next, I joined the side seams of the bodice with the right sides together, and then repeated the same thing for the lining side seams. I ironed up all of those seams and moved on to the sleeves. So I began by putting 2 rows of gather stitches on top of the sleeve as well as the bottom sections of the sleeves. All of these areas are marked with little X's on the pattern, and I just place a clip to transfer the mark to the fabric. You could definitely use a marking pin instead. So adjusting my stitch length back down, I stage stitch around the keyhole, opening on the sleeve. This is an important step, so please do not skip it. It'll help keep the shape of the keyhole intact as we attach the bias band. Once again, I'm taking a bias strip that's about 1 inch wide, with each side ironed about 1/4 inch. And I keep this plenty long. It is just one less thing to worry about. I began by attaching the bias band to the wrong side of the sleeve, and then I trim up that seam and flip the bias band to the right side of the sleeve. This order of operations makes it easy to place your stitches where you want them, which is just on the edge of that folded bias band. And you'll have something like this around the keyhole of that sleeve. Isn't it adorable? I am so in love with this little sleeve. Okay, so I joined the sleeve together using a French seam, and I keep this French seam on the tawny side alive. So then I grab a 1 inch wide strip that has been cut on the straight grain, and I fold over each of the ends so the raw edge is enclosed, and the length of the strip is given by the pattern piece. I fold the strip in half to find the center of it, and I pin the center to the seam of the sleeve. Then I gather up the section around the keyhole and sandwich the strip around the raw edge of the sleeve. I start sewing at one end of the strip and keep going as I get to the sleeve, and continue sewing and making sure that the bottom edge of that sleeve stays sandwiched between the folded band. And I continue this until I get to the end of that band. So then I gather up the top of the sleeve so I can attach it to my bodice. I put it right sides together with the bodice, with that arm's eye, and I leave the lining out of the step. You could include the lining if you want to, but I'm using corduroy, so I'm leaving it out to reduce the bulk. So I'm stitching around it, and then finish the seam however you like. So you can zigzag this or you can do it as a serger if that's your preference. However you want to finish it, you do that. You can also hand sew the lining raw edge into the seam. Coutureland does this a lot, and I love this little trick. So moving on to that skirt, I mark where the placket should extend on the back of the skirt and cut straight to that point. Then I take a 2 inch wide strip of fabric that is plenty long and put this right side together with the back of that skirt at that slit. We are inserting a placket here, and to do this, begin with the raw edges together and then slant off of your skirt as you approach the bottom of the V. When you get to the bottom of this V, put your needle down and adjust your fabric as needed, and continue to sew on. It is good practice to check to make sure there's no fabric caught at the bottom of that V, and then place a clip at the bottom to release the tension. And then I trim up those edges and give everything a really good ironing. I also trim up the other side of that placket strip so it's about 1 inch away from the seam. I fold over the placket strip once and I give that an ironing, and then fold it over again so the folded edge is in line with the seam of the placket, and I give that an ironing. You can absolutely sew the folded edge of the placket and strip by hand, and I normally do this, but with this corduroy plaid dress look I've got going on, I thought it was best to just secure the strip down by stitching in the ditch. Hopefully you can see how my needle is right in that previous seam, referred to as the ditch. So I just stitch along and those stitches will disappear. It's kind of neat, right? Finally, I fold the placket in half, lining up the raw edges at the top of the skirt, and then I stitch a little row of angled stitches at the bottom of the placket. And these angled stitches gives the placket a direction. It kind of puts the placket in its place, if you will. So next I joined the skirt front to the skirt back at the side seams using French seams. Make sure to join each piece with the nap going in the same direction. Just a friendly reminder if you're in the same boat as me with your fabric selection. And we are almost done at this point. Just gotta run 2 rows of gather stitches at the top of that skirt, one on each side of where those permanent stitches are gonna go later on. And I pull those gather threads until my skirt is the same length as the bottom of my bodice. Of course, adjust those gathers until they are evenly distributed. So you don't have to do this, but you can attach some of that same piping around the bottom of the bodice in the same manner as you did the neckline. So I did this and I took the first 1/2 inch of bulk out by trimming up that cording and then stitched the piping to the bottom of the bodice, again angling the raw edge off around the center back fold. So now we can join the bodice to the skirt. It's very exciting. Turn the right side of the placket under, and pinning that in place is something that I find helpful. Then I match up the folded edge of the placket to the folded edge of the bodice back, and then match up the bodice side seams to the skirt side seams. And finally match up the other side of the placket to the folded edge on the other center back. Adjust those gathers as needed and then stitch around the waist. I ironed the raw edge of the bodice lining under about 1/2 inch, and I'll hand sew that down in place using the machine stitches as a place to sew into. So I'll go into one stitch, kind of skip a few machine stitches, go into the next stitch, skip another few, go into the next one. You get the drift. Finally, I folded the bottom of the skirt's hem up about 1/2 inch, or you could do 1/4 inch if you wish. That 1/4 inch difference is really not going to make a difference. And I did this all the way around. Then I folded up again about 2.5 inches, and I do this by measuring at one point, putting in a pin, and then measuring another point a little ways away, putting in another pin. And then I figured that 2 points make a line, so that's accurate enough for a dress, and I iron everything into place. Then I machine sew the hem together. You can definitely hand sew the hem instead, and I've done that many times, but I thought machine sewing was best for this corduroy play dress. And the end of my spool was coming up on me at this point, so that's probably my cue, y'all. I did hand sewn buttonholes on the back, and I have plenty of videos that go over that. Check out this video though on 7 steps to a fully smocked bodice, or this 5 easy steps to perfect bullion roses every time. If you have any questions, please put them down in the comments below and I will do my best to answer them. And as always, I appreciate you all for watching, and I hope to catch y'all next time.